Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Public Sector I Heart You podcast. I'm Rebecca Davis, Chief Executive at West Midlands Employers, and today I'm joined by Stephanie Wheeler, who's an expert in organisational culture and engagement. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what senior leaders need to know across the organisation to make sure they get it right on organisational culture and engagement. So thank you for joining me, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Tell us a little bit about how you got into working around employee engagement and organisational culture.
My experience is really one of falling into it rather than by design. I started my career in organisational research, so very much doing primary and secondary research to understand and support management consultancy within organisations. So I then ended up realising that what I was most interested in was more of the organisational culture, communication, engagement and organisational change elements. So I suppose what I always try to do is get to the root cause of any issue. I like to peel back the layers and understand what's really happening at the heart of an issue or problem. Often people will tell you what they think those are, but through doing your organisational research, you really get behind those symptoms to the root cause. And I think that's how I've then realised over the years that a lot of those issues are in organisational culture and behavioural issues.
The two are really linked, aren't they? Organisations which traditionally have really high levels of engagement, would you say, have a stronger culture? Is that quite a sort of a join?
Absolutely. I think if people feel they are they're included, they understand the purpose of the organisation, they recognise why they're there and what their contribution is to that organisational purpose and what they deliver, then they're absolutely engaged. They feel, I see how what I do helps us deliver whatever it is, whether it's an NHS organisation, whether it's a retailer, whether it's financial services, whether it's central government, local government, you name it. If people feel their contribution is valued and have sight of how it supports the organisational purpose, then they're much more engaged.
And I know, because I've been on, I suppose, the receiving end really of you coming into an organisation and doing some of that work on several occasions. And I think what's really helpful is you bring the issues to life and you sort of really give a voice to people in the organisation. And that's part of where people need to feel safe, isn't it? So how do you create that safety in an organisation for people to feel that they can have that voice?
I think that safety has got harder because I think of the changes in society, the profile of never feeling like people are off with social media, with the use of phones. So I think actually if I'm running group sessions, I find I have to, just check that we're all on the same page with what we mean by psychological safety, what we mean about a confidential and safe space. Also, sometimes people are much more nervous now about how what they are saying will be used. So I often say, at the end of the session, I can play back to you what I'm taking from our session as the themes or the issues, rather than your specific personal experiences. So I think it has become, a bit like culture has become much more popular in recent years, as in many organisations are shining the light into dark corners that they didn't previously. So is psychological safety and that feeling of, is this going to be played back out somewhere else to someone about what I've said and how I've said it?
Yeah. And there's something, isn't there, about people share their stories, they expect to see something happen as a result of that.
Yes.
So tell me a bit about how, when you're working with organisations, you try to ensure that they do something with what you're sharing, because it's one thing to ask, it's another thing to do, isn't it?
Yes, and I'd say over the last 10 years, that's the most frustrating thing, is when you put a lot of work into doing a form of culture review and people then don't implement the actions. So what I've started to do more recently is work with organisations to implement the actions, to sort of hold them to account on what happens next, because that way you have that understanding of that they're not trying to reinterpret the findings. They're working with you on what happens next, and you're holding on to the voices and the weight of responsibility from those views. So I think I always say, don't get me to ask the questions if you're not going to do anything with the answers, because often the best ideas will come from frontline workers, from people who are in the jobs, in the eye of the storm, if you like, about what the issues that organisation is facing, and they will know what needs to happen to make a difference. So it is working with them to come up with those solutions and ideas, and then allowing them to be part of implementing it.
Yeah, and it's not one solution often, is it? It's often quite complex and long-term.
Yes.
And hard for organisations to get things to stick.
Yes.
So do you often work with organisations where you'll go back and you'll sort of engage with them again at a later point just to sort of check the progress they've made?
Yes, I do that, and I also try and encourage them to put things in place so they can do that for themselves. So I think it's really important that the accountability sits with the organisation. I'm really happy going into places that other people don't like to go to, lift up stones to understand the reality behind issues, but also then holding not just leaders, because it will be people all over an organisation, to account about, well, what are you going to do to make a difference? It's fine to raise issues, to have a view on what needs to change, but I think for it to be successful, your organisational culture relies upon everyone playing a part in making and implementing those changes.
Absolutely. And I know you've been fortunate enough to walk across so many sectors. So without naming any organisations, have you seen any similarities between sort of public, private sector, or is it very much that there's a difference in terms of the maturity and the levels of engagement, or is it largely same issues?
I think everybody thinks they're different. Every organisation and every sector will have nuances of difference, but we're talking about people in organisations. I think some common themes are around how, as leaders, if you're very senior leaders, how are you genuinely tapping into your organisation, and how are you really understanding the employee experience you're creating for your organisation? Because often leaders rely on people feeding information up to them, and what happens is people sometimes only feed up what they think leaders want to hear.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because often you've gone into organisation when there's a really big issues presented and it's become a known issue. Leaders can often feel quite blindsided by that, can't they? They can
Yes.
not realise the scale or the depth associated with an issue. So how can senior leaders, whether that be in directors, head of service roles, make sure that they understand that temperature check in their teams, their directorates, their organisations?
There's a number of practical things that they can do to avoid the scenario of, I don't recognise this organisation, which sometimes I hear. It's about looking at where their touch points are across the employee experience, looking at what formal and informal mechanisms. So many organisations, for example, will have some form of engagement survey. That's a great tool, but it's only one tool. So it will give you a snapshot of how people are feeling, but it's getting behind that data to understand what the meaning is. And it's making sure that you do that in a number of different ways. Some organisations I've worked with have successfully introduced reverse mentoring groups where senior leaders will work not just with an individual, because that puts a lot of pressure on a junior individual, but a group of individuals. So maybe 10 or 12 revolving individuals that will meet as a group. They may not all be able to make it every time, but that leader then has a cohort that they're working with. They will share information about what their issues are as a leader. Those individuals will give their perspective. And every time I've done this, the leader is blown away by the amount of insight they get from the individuals, but also the individuals say, I know them now. I know much more about how they lead. I feel better connected. I could chat to them in the corridor or ask them for support on something or share something with them. So it creates a better connection. So that's a nice informal way of connecting.
And I think that's key, isn't it? Those are things which don't cost anything.
Yes.
Often I think there's a perception that employee engagement mechanisms have to be costly, that culture change requires quite big, expensive consultancies or programs, but actually sometimes it's the simple things, isn't it? Done
Yes,
well and consistently can make the big difference. So tell me about what your tips would be for someone in an organisation to start making a bit of a health check for themselves around what they do and what they could do.
Okay, so I think as a leader, the first really important thing is honesty. To be honest and transparent wherever you can about where the organisation is and challenges it's facing or opportunities you're looking to pursue, because that will help to build that trust and confidence, and people will then feel they actually can have those conversations with you. So I think it's looking at, well, what are my messages out to the organisation? If you're a leader, look back across the last 12 months and think, what have I communicated and how have I communicated it? Give yourself a bit of a review on what did I do well and why, and what didn't I land very well, and how could I do that differently for the next 12 months? And I'd say look ahead as to what are the key messages you want to land and why do you want to land them? So what's in it for the organisation and the individuals? And I think the thing that I say repeatedly, I'm a bit like a broken record, is whatever you're going to communicate or try to engage people with, think about the know, feel, do.
Yeah.
What do you want them to know? How do you want them to feel?
Yeah.
And what do you want them to do as a result of hearing from you? It's really simple. If you just do it all of the time, it helps you put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're trying to engage with. So I think look back at what have I done and how have I done it. Look forward to what do I want to land. And then look at what are the existing channels in the organisation that we can use. So there might be newsletters, there might be town halls, there might be team briefings. And then what are the other channels that I can create through informally talking to people, building that trust and rapport. And if you feel really brave, be really honest about something you've done that hasn't gone very well and why you think it didn't go well and you're learning from it. Because if you expect people as a leader to feed up to you about what isn't working, they need to know that there's not that risk of putting their head above the parapet and being blamed for being honest. So I think that honesty of, well, I recognise I could have done this better and these are the reasons that I think I could do something differently and better in the future, I think will help to build that trust.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely vital, isn't it? That's the cornerstone, really, of having a healthy organisational culture. We've talked a lot about employees who are currently in organisations and their, I suppose, awareness and engagement. What about new recruits coming in? Because often there's a bit of a mismatch, isn't there, where people are recruited into a culture, which looks all very wonderful, and then they come in and they start to see that they might not all be as it seems. So how do organisations need to approach talking about their culture honestly to new recruits?
It's a really important point, and so many times people say, well, in my recruitment process, I heard a lot about this, but then my experience of joining, I haven't seen any of that or heard from that person, or it feels like it's a very different place. So I think just being conscious about what are we selling in our attraction and recruitment, and are we able to deliver on that in our induction, our onboarding, and the experience we create? So I think your new joiners are a really powerful tool to your organisation because they are objective and you haven't instilled them in any sort of biases. They come in and they will give you an honest and open view of their first experience. So I would say look at how you check in with them in those early days, look at how you listen to them and act on what they tell you.
And again, I think that's a really good takeaway, that doesn't cost anything, does it, to have that regular check-in? Because we know across the region we've got about a 15% departure rate of new recruits within the first 12 months. That's a huge resource lost when we've gone to huge effort to recruit great people in. Something about them is not staying. So by tracking their experience allows us to really change that, doesn't it?
And I think if you say you had, 15, 20 new joiners in January, February, March, you could look at, well, let's get them together. Because that creates a peer network for them, that they can support each other. They all feel they're in a similar position. But equally, that gives you insight across your organisation. I know many organisations are investing heavily in apprenticeships. So often in apprenticeships, there's a lot of weight put on not just the knowledge, but the skills and behaviours that we're expecting. So you can see how, as an organisation, you're setting the tone for your values, but then their experience of, are those values being lived by the people that are leading them, are teaching them, are working with them? It's a good sense check back to your culture around, well, how alive are our values?
Yeah, absolutely. And values are very subjective, aren't they? What one word means to one person can mean something very different to another person. So how can organisations keep their values in conversation, isn't it? It's the constant dialogue around them.
It is, and it's the role modelling of them. So I think any organisation I work with, I will often say, so talk to me about that particular value. When have you seen that most lived, and how has it been lived? And then they will often cite an individual or several individuals who live that value. And it's like, okay, so we've got people who are credible and trusted and role models of the values. So how do we showcase that? How do we recognise those people for what they're doing? And on the flip side of that, when you say, when has that value been challenged over the last 12 months? And sometimes values are legitimately challenged because of a pressure cooker situation. But what do we do to acknowledge that it was challenged, and to dig into, well, how can we ensure that that doesn't happen again, or that we support individuals who experienced our values being challenged?
I think that's an incredibly powerful question, actually, when our values challenged, because it happens every day, but we often gloss over it, don't we? And assume that we should be perfect and values should be upheld all the time. Well, actually, we're human. People sometimes say, do, act in ways which don't, but it doesn't mean there's not a conversation to be had, and it shouldn't be considered in that wider sense, isn't it?
And I think there's a real difference between someone veering away from a value and having a bad day to someone who is consistently not living that value and is making life difficult for their team, or those that are in another team. So it's really holding people to account around not just what they do, but how they do it. Because you can have a brilliant team leader in terms of delivery, but no one wants to be in their team.
Yeah.
And I think recognising that to have engagement, we need not just the what we do. I don't just need to know what you want from me in terms of the goals I must deliver, my objectives. I also need to know that I'm going to be supported if things are difficult. I'm going to be enabled. I'm going to be inspired. I'm going to be motivated. And I'm going to be challenged if I don't deliver in a way that's in alignment with the values.
Yeah, and it's the how, isn't it? It comes back to the how people do it.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about current employees. We've talked about those coming into the organisation. It feels only right we should go to the other end of the spectrum, to those that are leaving the organisation. Now, often organisations don't always ask the question about what their experience has been like when they're exiting an organisation through different routes. So just tell us a bit about how that information is often really valuable as well, and should be captured, and ways people can capture that.
They're, again, a really powerful group. So people exit for many different reasons. And what's nice is some people exit and then return. So some people are exiting to get a different experience. Some people are exiting to leave something that they feel has, they can't progress anymore, or others are leaving because they don't like it anymore. So I think really understanding why people leave your organisation, and if they leave as advocates or if they leave with a very negative feeling, is really important to your organisational brand. So I think those exit interviews should happen. I think look at who you get to do them, because people will not be open and honest if they feel, one, that there's no point because nothing will happen with it, or two, that they don't trust the person that is delivering that. So I think looking at what questions you ask, who asks them, and then what do you do with it? Because most of the time they just get shoved in the cupboard. And how are you using that to also feed into that employee engagement data, and to what happens next around, well, we've got some really strong lessons here about this person right from induction was having issues, because some people who will leave you may only have been there, as you mentioned earlier, a few months or 12 months or 18 months. So their issues may have started in induction or onboarding or in their first line manager. So it's looking what's behind their reasons for leaving, but also what's the organisational learning. And often that, I think, is where organisations most miss the opportunity to address issues.
Yeah, absolutely. It's seeing it as a mechanism to learn and evolve, isn't it? And when you think, certainly within the public sector, our biggest resource, our biggest financial commitment is our workforce. You start to think, well, why wouldn't we be doing everything possible to make sure that workforce is as productive, as supportive, is a culture which people thrive in? What would be your sort of biggest message to sort of senior leaders, workers across the region about how they can really capitalise on employee engagement for their benefit?
I think something that struck me with a lot of the organisations that WME works with is we're not telling the story of what it's like to work in local government, the opportunities that local government offers in terms of variety. Having worked across a number of different sectors over 25 years, I think that what I see in local government is the opportunity to work in so many different areas within one organisation, but also to have quite a high level of autonomy quite quickly, and an opportunity to engage with very diverse communities in your role that you don't get in many other sectors. So I think it's telling that story of what your career could look like and the opportunities that local government creates, because many of the younger generation that are coming into the workforce now aren't seeing local government in the light that it actually is. They're seeing it as it was, and they may only know local government for a very small number of things, very transactional things. So I think showcasing the stories of the different careers is one thing, but also if I was a leader in local government, I would be understanding much more about the employee experience I'm creating, and I would be tapping into those different audiences in different teams. I wouldn't be relying just on my peers and the leaders I lead to give me feedback. I would be naturally curious and wanting to go and have my own conversations. Not to say my colleagues aren't helpful to give me their opinions, but just to get out and understand more what it's like to be you doing the job that you're doing. Because probably for those leaders leading now, the job is very different to how you were doing it 20 years ago. So I'd ask you to step back in and try and understand what it's like to do each of the roles in different functions that you may have done on your journey up to the leader that you now are.
And I think that is a call for people to be curious, isn't it? Be curious about what people's experiences are. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been incredibly insightful, and I could spend all day talking to you about engagement, employee experience and culture. So thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you for joining us today, and hope you enjoyed this latest edition of the Public Sector I Heart You podcast.